let's go to this brain. Okay, so for picture A, where's the sulci?
Right there.
Yeah,
Pointer.
there's one. There's one. And where's the gyri?
The ridges.
Yeah, little bumps.
Can you tell us which photos you're going to have on the exam or no?
Yeah,
Okay.
only the photos that I gave on the homework will I use on the exam.
On the homework or on this?
This is the homework.
Oh, that's the homework.
We only had one homework on
Did
the
he
brain.
just send out a list of brain?
Yeah, and so only those lists on the homework will be those on the exam. But they're the same with a few that I cut out because I gave you your list before Thanksgiving and I didn't get to some. I forgot to mention the meeting amendments, things like that.
Okay. So that list and the homework are exactly the same?
Yeah.
Okay. Except.
And it's also the same as the list in, this list of the homework covers everything that is the list of the lab. The thing that I noticed with people as far as the lab is that you are not putting much emphasis into what was asked in the questions in the lab and the histology of the lab. And so I would advise you to complete your lab books and know histology as well as anatomy and know why and what, for instance, phasic and tonic receptors and what the receptors are that we went through in our lab explanations. Just because they're like, hey, I understand that. But go through it. So to study for the lab exam, make sure that you study your lab book. Because I know sometimes people will skip it. That can burn you. Okay, so let's go through this one. The contralateral hemispheres, all I meant was that the hemispheres, that the information coming in switches to the other side and the information going out switches sides. Lateralization, so which hemisphere is dominant?
Left. 90% of
Yeah, and it's usually whichever hand they are, so right or left-handed. And then, what's the difference in the way people think for the right hemisphere?
Creative.
Okay,
Artistic.
so left is logical, right is right. Creative. Emotional is deeper. Where's the frontal lobe? Right. Where is the parietal lobe? What separates the parietal and the frontal? Right. What is behind the lateral sulcus? Right. Wow.
Let there be light.
And now we don't know because Corinne left, so we don't know how to turn it back off. So you want me to just somebody want to go back there and turn that off? Or is it? Do you think this? I tried. I'll see if this one works. It didn't work.
Oh, I thought you were the one that turned it off.
No, she did.
Oh, she did.
I think.
That's fine.
Oh.
No.
Like that side got darker. Oh.
Okay, don't.
They were turning off the wrong lights.
Oh.
You can fiddle with those in the back.
So let's see what this does.
I think they
There
both.
you go. Okay, I got it.
That's good. That's
Okay.
good, Bret.
I got it.
They both control the same thing. That one lights up when you push buttons.
Okay. All right. So then we have to know what the different functions. So what does the so give me a one sentence of the frontal lobe function.
Executive reasoning and thinking.
Reasoning, thinking, and motor. Along the central sulcus on the frontal side is the what?
The pre-central?
No.
I'm sorry, I didn't even listen to you.
Along the central sulcus on the frontal side
Primary
is
motor
the
cortex?
primary motor cortex. And then what do all the associative areas of the sensory systems, what do they all pretty much do?
Interpret.
They
Interpret.
interpret the information
Yeah.
that the cortex receives.
Yeah. And same thing with this motor, the prefrontal. It's just the premotor cortex is just giving you interpreting and determining that's executed by the primary motor neurons. The what's the cortical spinal tract?
It's like the way the message is sent.
Right. So it's the message sent from the pyramidal cell in the cortex all the way down to the spine. And as it goes down that track, it's going to go, I think we have it farther down here. But yeah, we do. We'll talk about it later. And then in homunculus, all I need you to know is if we were to look at 7 centimeters down the central, the primary sensory, the motor cortex, yeah, what would move? The homunculus, just to know that that the primary motor cortex is mapped on the brain. What's Broca's area?
Speech.
Yeah, motor movements of speech. And then the prefrontal cortex, what does it do?
Thinking and executing thoughts.
Yeah, and believe it or not, it's in the prefrontal area.
How do we
Is
gonna
it smaller?
How are we gonna memorize that?
Is it smaller or larger in humans than rats?
Should be larger,
Should be
Yeah.
larger.
Much larger.
hopefully.
Right, for
Humans.
some of us.
I've
Some
met
of-
a
I've
few
met
that
most.
rats may be larger.
Yeah.
Some of us.
That's up for debate.
The parietal lobe, bless you. The parietal lobe is located where?
Over the parietal bone.
Yeah, exactly. Under. And then, what is the in the parietal lobe? There's the along the next to what sulcus is the primary somatosensory cortex.
The central
Oh,
sulcus.
central.
So it's the
nervous.
central. Yep. Just the both side, right? And what innervates directly innervates or explain the pathway, I guess, of the of a sensory neuron to get to this cortex, the somatosensory cortex.
So
And
go
so-
from the sensory neuron to eventually the spine, up through, is it
The brain.
thalamus?
Yep. And the
Right.
thalamus is the key thing.
Yeah, thalamus
So-
over to the primary
Relay
somatosensory
center?
cortex.
Yes. And then you have an associative area right next to it. The occipital lobe, what's in it?
Vision.
Vision. Where's the visual cortex?
On the very back bottom.
Yep, very back bottom. And then temporal lobe. What do we think of with temporal lobe? What do we-
Auditory.
Auditory. And that's what's there. And then in between, so when we're pulling this lateral sulcus up, and I'm showing it right here, you have the primary olfactory cortex. What I was trying to show is it's on the inside layer. You guys get that?
Oh.
I didn't know how to show it, so it's inside of this temporal lobe fold. And I must be getting hungry because I'm.
Oh, part of the insula.
So on the other side of the insula, so here's the insula, and then here's the primary. Here's the primary olfactory cortex on the inside, basically touching the insula, but on the other side of it. And then what's here? And then here, or in the same area. You don't have to know which one's which.
Isn't that the gustatory?
Right, vestibular and
This
and visceral. Right.
Visceral.
But you don't have to know specifically where they are in there?
No,
You have to
just know they're
there.
in the insula.
Okay.
And then the what does the posterior associative area do?
Recognizes patterns, bases, local organisms.
Yep. And one of the patterns that it recognizes is in an area of the Verninkies. What kind of patterns does it recognize in the Verninkies?
Recognize spoken language.
Right. So that's your language sign. And then for picture B, so here's picture B. What are these axonal tracts that go from the cortex all the way down to the spine?
There's the projection fibers?
Yeah.
And there are projection fibers. And specifically, what is this one that goes in between the basal ganglia and down around the thalamus to where it becomes the cerebral pedicles?
Corona radiata.
Internal capsule.
Is
Yeah,
it
the internal capsule.
And where's the corona radiata?
And then all these that are going along next to it and partly forming it, that are coming from these radiations, are called the what?
Coronas.
Yeah, corona radiata. And it's mainly we make you learn it just because it's such a cool sounding word. And then what is the fibers that go from one gyri to the next one?
Those are the association fibers.
Yeah, or they arc from one gyri to the next. They're arcuates. And then what is it that connects one hemisphere to the other? Commissural. And give me an example of the main commissural.
Corpus callosum.
Right.
I'm sorry, the internal capsule is just referring to one particular bunching of those projection fibers?
Oh, these
Is it just
tracks,
one
yeah.
particular area?
Yeah. Basically, it's these tracks that then form here, and it's predominantly coming out of the frontal side of the central gyrus. Why is it coming predominantly from the frontal side of the central gyrus?
Motors.
So your motor axon's going down to your spine, right? So this is your cerebral spinal tract. So you have all these fibers coming down to tell your muscles to move. So your voluntary movements are they're skipping the rest of the brain, basically. But they go right between this part here, which is called the.
That's the internal capsule.
So this is the internal capsule, and what is this group of nuclei at the base of the cerebellum? Yes.
You have basal nuclei and ganglia for that.
So that means the same thing. It's just that because I keep on calling them ganglia, and the book keeps on saying it's not ganglia, it's nuclei.
Okay, and that's the caudate and the pediment.
Right, but we just know them together as the
Striatum.
striatum. Yes,
And on the right picture, can you see, is that the chain that's sticking out there?
right here?
Yeah.
Yes.
And is the, can you see the caudate and piece on there? Like the head of, or is it just the chain?
I think that this is where is the head of the caudate, but we can't really the tail coming around like that. I think. But yeah, so caudate putamen. Here we can see it. There's the tail.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Corona radiata are connecting the,
So they're projection fibers. They can go to, for instance, here we see them going to the thalamus. So they don't only form into the internal capsule. They can also go to other brain areas.
are they primarily in white matter?
They are white matter, yeah. They're fibers, projection fibers. I'm sorry, fibers means axons, same as it does in the peripheral nervous system. Right?
Okay.
Okay. So that's what, so these fiber tracts is just so instead of them calling them nerves, they're now called tracts. And we have the projections, the commissure, the associate, and you don't have to know about the other ones. Okay, so now we have the basal ganglia and the lateral ventricle. So what ventricle is this? It forms around the basal ganglia, right here. Here's the basal ganglia, and then what's this? Lateral. And is it simply always nice and close to the together like this, or does it kind of form into this sort of a shape here?
Add more shape.
Yeah. So it's forming like a ram's horn, you know, as it goes out laterally. What's the area separate? No, just joking. You don't have to know that. Thank you, Jamie, for laughing.
Someone's gotta laugh at your jokes. I feel bad for you.
It's kind of. And so then, if we look at this ventricle here, what ventricle is that? Right down the middle of the thalamus, right. Okay, going back up. What is the function of the basal ganglia? I can't hear you.
Brain reward center. Oh.
No.
That's
That's
true.
the nucleus accumbens.
That's within the basal ganglia, so we'll give her that. What else?
Filters movement.
Yes. So you smooths movements,
Habits.
so you don't have insomnia, and forms habits. And with the nucleus accumbens, what habit forming are you going to deal a lot with in the nursing world?
Addiction.
Addiction. Not hopefully you personally, but you're going to see people that have problems with substance abuse. And then the other disorder that we see with where people seem like they have an obsessive need to do certain habits. It's called OCD. And then
So you were saying this is for movement as well?
yeah, so it smooths movement, if that makes sense.
Oh, I mean like a dancer?
No, like so that when I grab my glasses, I'm not going like this.
Oh.
So Parkinson's.
Yeah. So like those Parkinson's tremors, not tremor. And then now let's go to the limbic system. And this is the only picture that I had of the limbic system, so this is the only one that you guys have to know. What is this area here?
Cingulate.
Gyrus.
Yeah. And it's really the same as this area here. So if you go down this middle portion, what's this middle sulci-like thing called? Longitudinal fissure. So if you cut the brain apart, the longitudinal fissure, and we look at the two cerebral hemispheres, at the bottom of basically right before it becomes the corpus callosum, it's the cingulate gyrus. So that's what this is. The going out and wrapping into the subcortical areas, so underneath the cortex, but we don't have any good, the only thing we have is that one histology slide. And that histology slide is showing an area of learning and memory, and that's called the hippocampus. And it kind of looks like a seahorse or a jelly roll. I think it looks a lot more like a jelly roll because neuroanatomists don't have, shows you how pathetic neuroanatomists are. They don't get out of the, which means I've seen that video too many times. Like a jelly roll.
Jelly roll.
It's so It looks like this. So if you see a structure that looks like this,
That pink one.
what is it?
Hippocampus.
Hippocampus. And what's it involved in? Yeah, it's the C.
Decorative
This is actually called the C bodies.
And what was the V structure again?
And this is called the dendrite gyrus.
That's right.
But you only have to know that for the lab. And the hippocampus purpose that we've gone over? Yeah. And then right at the here forming like an olive. No, it's the amygdala. And that's involved in what?
Fight or flight.
Fight or flight.
Not really
fear.
fight or flight. No, it will induce fight or flight, but it's determining danger,
Fear and danger.
fear and danger, and learning from fear and danger. So, as I said before, that learning of I'm going to whoop your butt if you do that again. So that fear learning is your amygdala.
It also attaches emotion to memories.
Yeah, it gives emotional tone, especially negative emotional tone. And it's inhibited by the prefrontal cortex, and that is an area of major research with people with PTSD, to give that, to remove emotional tone, negative emotional tone from memory of a traumatic event, which seems to be dysfunctional in PTSD. Okay, and that's that for that area. Oh, what does the cingulate gyrus do? Did we mention associative and pain? Associates memories, emotions with various events, and such as facial recognition, people's faces. So you can give tests. I've told some people this. You give tests to a 5-year-old, and if they have certain types of mental health disorders, such as the pre-adolescent bipolar disorder, that they'll look at the face and they'll say, "Oh, she's very sad," and it's a smiling face, and then they'll look at a face that they're crying and they'll be like, "They're very happy," so they don't get this cingulate gyrus is somehow messed up. Okay, and that of course is making a statement about something that one really doesn't know. Nobody does in science, how bipolar disorder occurs. So that's the limbic system, and now we'll just go to this last picture. What's this? If we just rip these cerebral hemispheres off and the underlying cortical structures, subcortical structures. So we have this, before we get to the midbrain, we're going to be this area that is the center brain. What is that? The diencephalon. And what makes up the diencephalon?
Thalamus.
Yep. Hypothalamus.
Pineal.
And all
Yeah.
the thalamuses, epithalamus, hypothalamus.
Yeah,
thalamus.
although I didn't mention epithalamus.
Thalamus
Yeah.
and hypothalamus.
It's just all
Yeah.
the thalamuses.
Yep, it's a thalamic area.
The
So, what does the thalamus do again?
Relay center.
Yeah. And somebody was asking a question about epilepsy. So certain types of epilepsy are dysfunctions of the thalamus. Specifically, one type is the petite mal, so where people like all of a sudden fall asleep into a deep sleep in the middle. All of a sudden for like 10 seconds they go into deep sleep.
Something like that.
What?
Narcolepsy.
Oh, no.
Narcolepsy is a different one, where their body falls asleep. So this one only their cortex does, through the thalamus. It's like all of a sudden it goes, and they get these deep sleep-like waves. Okay, the thalamus, and then below the thalamus is this area, and what's it involved in?
Reptilian brain.
So it's involved in reptiles? Can you be more specific?
What was the question?
What does the hypothalamus do?
Oh, it's the
So drives, hunger, etc., and hormone secretions, homeostasis, maintaining homeostasis, which is really through hormone secretion, and sleep. And then within, now we're going to go down. I'm just going to wing it because I don't want to keep going back and forth, and I know these areas fairly well. So this next area of the brain is called the what?
Midbrain. Midbrain.
The midbrain. And right above it, there's this gland that's part of the diencephalon.
It's a pineal
And
gland.
what does it secrete?
Melatonin.
Melatonin specifically. Maybe DMT. And then what does this gland right at the bottom of the hypothalamus,
Pituitary.
and what does it secrete? Hormones. And then this portion right here is the, you guys just told me,
Midbrain.
midbrain. And then what is this part of the cerebral spinal fluid circulation?
Cerebral aqueduct.
Yeah, the cerebral aqueduct. And what are the bumps on the midbrain?
Is it a
What?
quadrigeminal?
Yeah, and what's the superior colliculi? Right. And the inferior?
Sound.
Right. And then the collectively, what are the four bumps called? Or the, thank you.
Dictum.
And then, but the midbrain has in areas inside around the cerebral aqueduct, and they secrete, they have axons that project throughout the brain, secreting what neurotransmitter? Especially to, for instance, the basal ganglia to give pleasure. Nope.
Dopamine.
Dopamine, yes.
You said it was there
At the midbrain.
at the midbrain. Like
One of those
specifically?
structures is called substantia nigra. What disease results in an obliteration of substantia nigra?
Parkinson.
Right. The right next to the midbrain, we have this area that's kind of like an Adam's apple of the brainstem. What would we call this?
Pons.
And all these axons are going into this region here, which is called the. Okay. And then forming with the nuclei of the midbrain of dopamine, we have nuclei that are secreting other neurotransmitters that modulate brain activity, increasing awakening. And the one that here, about here, we'll say, that is releasing a neurotransmitter that can cause panic attacks, and is used for increasing of people artificially activate it for increasing arousal and focus. What is that neurotransmitter? And what's the nuclei that releases it?
Is that the
Or what
locus?
location is it? What's the location?
Is that the locus?
Yes,
The locus something.
Ceruleus.
Yeah.
locus ceruleus,
Oh, but isn't that in the ponds?
right next to it. Yeah,
Oh,
but I want specifics.
next to ponds?
I mean, it's kind of in the ponds. It's part of the reticular formation. It's a loose conglomeration of these nuclei that go from here to here. Yes.
We're gonna have to identify the individual nuclei.
No, you're not gonna have to. You have to identify their names, not their locations.
How about their patterns within the brain?
No. The reason I did that is I wanted you guys to see that they go everywhere. That they're not just stuck. You know, one thinks that the nuclei, therefore they're only have actions here, but their axons go throughout the brain. And so therefore when you give somebody methamphetamine, increasing dopamine and norepinephrine, their whole brain gets fried, right? When you give somebody DMT, their whole brain fries. When you give somebody atropine, you put the entire brain to sleep because atropine blocks acetylcholine. And so where art thou, dear Romeo, or whatever she says, and she takes her atropine, or belladonna. So, what's the neurotransmitter secreted by the nuclei that keeps the whole brain awakened? Basically, if you block this, then your brain goes into sleep. Acetylcholine, yes. Now, what is it that awakens the brain? What's the alarm clock of the brain? No, but the clock is determined by melatonin.
The superchiasmatic.
Yeah. So melatonin sets the clock, and then the SCN is the clock that then rings. So it's the alarm clock.
So what about RF?
So the reticular formation is all of these nuclei here. So the alarm clock goes in your head, and then it activates areas in the hypothalamus and in this and the reticular formation to all get activated. There's two neurotransmitters released by nuclei within the hypothalamus that you have to know that awaken the brain. One of them is associated with narcolepsy. What is that neurotransmitter?
What is histamine?
One of them is histamine.
And the other
That's
one is,
associated with Benadryl eating, for instance.
Starts with an O.
Yes. Starts with an O.
Orexin.
Orexin.
And you said that's the thalamus?
No, that's at both are hypothalamus,
Hypothalamus.
but they go throughout the brain. And then, so those are the awakening. And then there's only one neurotransmitter we mentioned for sleeping. What's that?
GABA.
GABA, right. And so, what kind of drugs do you give somebody to put them to sleep? So what does Ambien do? What does Ambien do? Sorry to go on a tangent, but just to help you guys through this. Ambien blocks histamine receptors. But what about Xanax? That increases GABA A. So you're going to increase GABA A activity. It's going to inhibit all those neurons from firing, and so that's the whole point of the initial picture that we saw, where you have GABA on one side, glutamate on the other. The GABA is putting your neuron to sleep. The glutamate is putting it to awake. So, for instance, if we have somebody that has status epilepticus, Jess, what's going to happen? How are we going to block that glutamate system from going out of control? What's one way to do it? Yeah, hit the GABA. Give them barbiturates galore. Enough barbiturates to usually kill them, but we keep them on a respirator. And then, okay, so going down farther, so did everyone get the reticular activating system, the reticular formation, and the neurotransmitters that are released there? Those neurotransmitters, do they open up ion channels or active GPCRs? Yes. So they're just modulating is the word. So they're just going to change intercellular effects to make the neuron more or less sensitive. They increase your focus or decrease it.
Formation and reticular activating area.
It's the same.
So I have mainly that's in the pons.
Right, it
area.
is.
Okay.
It's just that the dopamine ones are above the pons.
The substantia nigra.
Yeah, and there's actually, I think, a RAF-A nuclei that drops down below the pons. Oh, serotonin does what to the brain? The buzzword? Relaxes, not sleeps. Sleep, it actually has low serotonin.
Oh.
So it relaxes it. Yeah, but to dream, now there's the rest. Okay, so now, so serotonin is kind of like the brakes on norepinephrine. Just so you guys know. You don't have to know that for the exam, but if that helps you think about it. So it relaxes it, and norepinephrine makes you anxious. And then the cerebellum is innervated through these cerebellar pedicles, And what else do we have up here?
That's not it.
So it's separated into hemispheres and lobes, and the tracts that come and go from the cerebellar cortex are called together. They're arbor vitae, the tree of life.
This is the axon tracks.
And then at the cerebellar cortex, what is the function of the cerebellum as a whole?
Balance.
Yep, coordination. And what ventricle is forming between the cerebellum and the brainstem? Fourth. And then the fourth ventricle becomes the
Central canal.
spinal cord. And you guys are done. Only thing I can think of is maybe there's some things we didn't mention on the exam with the little if TRPA1 gets activated. Trying to think of anything. Then that part where C fibers we already went over that. Local release of inflammatory factors, action potentials. Yeah, I think we've covered everything.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All
You
the
guys are gonna do
different-
great.
All the different types of fibers in both the